Hi friends, today I want to read this done by Jerry B. Harvey a long time back. The article is called Organizations as Frog Farms, spelled as PHROG. I thought it was a very interesting article. It also is still relevant for all of us as leaders. So I would like to read this and also kind of um, discuss where it is relevant and how it is still um, relevant after all these years, decades after what it was written. So here we go. Organizations as Frog Farms by Jerry B. Harvey. A short time ago, I received a telephone call from a friend of mine who was employed as an OD specialist in a large corporation. Jerry, I've just been fired, he said. Fired? You mean you're out of a job completely? Well, not completely, he replied. I'm just no longer an OD specialist. In fact, the whole function has been wiped out. They've given me a make work job in salary administration. It is a nothing job though. I hate it. I was really interested in doing OD. All I'm doing now is cut work and drawing a paycheck. Why were you fired, Hank? I'm not really sure. I've never heard the reason directly. My boss's boss was the one who really did the firing. He told my boss to do it. Well, did he tell your boss he wanted you fired? My boss was vague about it. He just said his boss had said I wasn't powerful enough to do the job. What did your boss's boss say to you when you asked him about it? I haven't talked with him. Why not? That would be violating the chain of command. You don't do that around here. Why not? You can get fired for that. But Hank, I said, you have been fired. Oh. And then perhaps because I had recently read my children the fable of the princess and the frog, I said, Hank, your boss's boss is correct. You're not powerful enough to do the job. In fact, for all intents and purposes, he has turned you into a frog. PHROG. I can almost see you in a big frog pond with your boss's boss sitting on a willow stump saying to himself, I think I'll turn old Hank into a frog. Then he waves a magic wand, mutters some mystical sounding incantation, and concludes with, Hank, you're a frog. And suddenly you have webbed feet. Hank, you are now a frog. The silence at the other end of the line was seemingly interminable. Finally, out came the poignant one-word reply that echoed down the line. Repeat. Organizations as frog farms. After talking with Hank at some length about his life in the frog pond, I got to thinking that most formal organizations are, metaphorically speaking, frog farms. By frog farms, I mean that they turn a lot of good people into frogs. In addition, if we accept the metaphor of organizations as frog farms, we might conceptualize organizational development as the process of training the swarm. Therefore, building upon that metaphor, I would like to suggest a number of hypotheses, make some generalizations, and to conceptualize some issues of organization, management, and organizational development within the framework of life in the swamp. These various statements are provided in no particular order of importance and in no conscious linear sequence, as follows. Number one, all organizations have two essential purposes. One is to produce widgets, globs, and Phillips. The other is to turn people into frogs. In many organizations, the latter purpose takes precedence over the former. For example, in many organizations, it is more important to follow the chain of command than to behave sensibly. Now, Number 2, frog is spelled with a PH because frogs don't like to be known as frogs. And they try to hide their frogginess from themselves and others by transparent means. In short, once one has been transformed into a frog, one likes to attempt to hide that fact. For one who has been a person, it's a great come down to be a frog. Frogs tend to live a solitary life in the swamp, or as one frog said, it's a lonely life on the lily pad. Frogs compete with one another for insects, vie for the right to head the flicking order of the swamp, and are ultimately evaluated for what they do in their own mud flats. Furthermore, frogs don't really get rewarded for how well they sing in the chorus. Given that, is it any wonder that a common frog maxim is, you can't get involved with other frogs in the swamp? Someday, you may have to appropriate their lily pads. Frogs speak the language of ribbit. The language is simple because it contains only one word, but it doesn't communicate very well. When all the frogs in the swamp croak ribbit, swamp is noisy as hell, but not a lot of real information is ever exchanged. You see, accuracy of information is not very important in the swamp. In fact, anytime a person enters the swamp, he or she is generally told why the language of ribbit is the only possible language of the swamp. Despite the fact that frogs don't learn much from one another when they use it. For that reason, people have a difficult time talking with frogs. In fact, they seldom talk with frogs at all. Number 5, most frogs spend more time flicking flies in the fog than in draining the swamp. As best I can tell, their behavior is circular. If they were to spend time draining the swamp, there would be no flies to flick and no frogs. For that reason, it's very important to frogs to maintain the swamp as it is rather than to drain it. Number 6, in frog farms, bullfrogs generally get to be the president. Stated differently, the better a frog can tolerate the loneliness of his lily pad, the more competent he becomes at speaking the language of ribbit, the more facile he becomes in flicking flies, the more skillful he becomes at appropriating others' lily pads, and the more adroit he becomes at maintaining the swamp, the more likely he is to become president. Number 7, bullfrogs are generally revered in the swamp. In fact, other frogs assume bullfrogs have magical powers because of their unusual abilities to turn people into frogs. In one sense, such reverence may not be misplaced. They are apparently instrumental in the process of frog production. It is though strange to me that we have devoted so little effort to understanding the role that humans play in permitting frogs to attack them in the swamp. The magic exercised by bullfrogs comes from humans' belief in it. The tyranny of bullfrogs stems not from the reality of the bullfrog's power, but from the belief of humans in the myth of bullfrog power. Number 9, belief in the myth of bullfrog power prevents one from having to take responsibility for the fog and mud and moss that make up the atmosphere of the swamp. Number 10, frogs, particularly residents, frequently feel very trapped in the swamp. Many of them are destroyed by it. They feel trapped because they are trapped. Mr. Nixon was not an aberration. Number 11, one of the peculiarities of the swamp is that the masses of swamp frogs both worship and destroy bullfrogs for the very qualities of frogginess resulted in their becoming presidents. Number 12, Darwinians say only the strongest go to the top of the phylogenetic scale. Prologists say only the weakest go to the top of the same scale. Both say only the fittest survive. One is incorrect. 13. Another peculiarity of the swamp is that cow frogs seldom become presidents. Cow frogs apparently don't have the capacity for loneliness, the language of ribbit, fly flicking, and swamp maintenance that bullfrogs have. If by any chance they do develop that revered capacity, they become cow frogs in bullfrogs' clothing, and their croaks deepen. 14. The process of producing frogs is not sexual, it's magical. OD number 15. OD generally consists of frog kissing, which is magical, harmless, and platonic. Number 16. Any activity designed to facilitate frog kissing is an example of ODD behavior, cosmetic organizational development, or organizational development by deception, or OD, as practiced by frogs. Activities such as frog chorus building, inter-lily pad conflict resolution, frog sensing, frog style assessment, marsh groups, tadpole development, and frog coaching in the absence of swamp drainage, and area reclamation are examples of frog kissing by ODDites. 17. Frog kissing is a seductive activity. Frederick Hertzberg claims that being seduced is ultimately less satisfying than being raped. Because when we are seduced, we are in fact part of our own downfall. Stated differently, and in our context, ODD specialists are frequently seduced into frog kissing, an activity that seldom leads to love making, but frequently adds to the warts on the kisser's face. 18. Many organization members belong to Frognarian networks and swamp maintenance associations. The purpose of such networks and associations is to meet and exchange information regarding the nature of the frog in each member's respective swamp. Since the language of ribbit is employed, such exchanges seldom allow one to differentiate one swamp from another. Frogs seems to get reassurance from noting the similarity among their swamps, or as one bullfrog put it, misery loves company, and miserable frogs love miserable companies. 19. Occasionally, during meetings of frognarians, a frog farts in the fog. When that happens, that frog loses some of his or her frogginess, therefore represents a great threat to the balance of the swamp. Frog farts are seldom sanctioned by frognarians. They're too real. They put holes in the fog and ultimately threaten the atmosphere of magic required to maintain the swamp. 20. There is a myth on the part of frogs that kissing one another frog turns that frog into a prince. I think it should be noted that in general, kissing a frog only produces skin irritations. For those who decide to kiss anyway, I think they should also realize that in all the fog, it is very difficult to determine which way a frog is facing. Frogs frequently try to set traps for one another. Frog traps have a peculiar quality because they catch only the frogs who set them. Stated differently, if you have to set a frog trap, there is no need to do so. You are already in it. 22. So that the technology of setting frog traps is not lost to future generations, frog officers of marsh swamp management are hired by schools of swamp maintenance to research and teach. Frog officers of marsh management are not limited to swamp maintenance schools. In fact, they are on the faculties of all kinds of teaching organizations, defined not by what they teach, but by the attitude and approach with which they teach it. The work of such frog officers is governed by the underlying credo that is frequently displayed on their respective lily pads. It goes something like this. If the tadpole hasn't learned, the frog officer hasn't taught. The underlying rationale of that credo is rather peculiar if subjected to close scrutiny. To explain, it clearly implies that the basic responsibility for the tadpole's learning belongs to the frog officer. Consequently, if the tadpole does a lousy job, the frog officer is at fault. Likewise, following the same logic rigorously, if the tadpole does competent work, the frog officer must also get the credit. For all intents and purposes, then, the tadpole doesn't exist except as some sort of inanimate passive receptacle for the frog officer's competence or incompetence. 23. Given that such a teaching attitude implies that students have no animate existence, is it any wonder that students seem to fit so well into the lonely parallelism of the swamp? Is it also any wonder that when someone accepts responsibility for another's learning, that person ceases to be an educator and becomes a frog officer? Whose primary job is it to prepare tadpoles for life in the swamp? 24. People frequently become frogs in other kinds of organizations by the same process. After all, a common swamp saying is, you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. Translation, you are responsible for your subordinates' performance. If your subordinates perform competently, it is because of you. If they perform incompetently, it is because of you too. Like students, they don't even exist, except as extensions of you. They are objects you must manipulate in the best interest of the swamp. If frogs don't feel they are responsible for the performance of their subordinates, why do so many of them go to training programs designed to help them alter their styles of frogging? As I see it, they do it because they believe they are responsible for their subordinates' performances, and that their style, as opposed to their essence, has something to do with how effectively their subordinates perform. 25. All of us are frogs at one time or another. All have the potential to develop webbing between their groups. All have experienced the terror of the trap, and accepting responsibility for others' action is the bait with which frog traps are set. 26. Many bullfrogs can't laugh at the absurdity of their lives in the swamp. Such frogs tend to become steer frogs and are very poignant creatures. Bullfrogs frequently die laughing, but I have never seen a steer frog laugh. They just croak. The seat of our government, located in Washington, D.C., in a swampy area of the city known affectionately to some as Foggy Bottom. For many, it is also the locus of the bureaucratic mess. Perhaps it should be renamed Foggy Bottom. 28. Making Waves in Foggy Bottom by Alfred Narrow is a book about an OD effort to clean up the bureaucratic mess in the US Department of State. In its essence, the book is about the failure of that effort. Should you decide to read it, you might come to realize that making waves in any organization is a very different process from draining the swamp. 29. The size of the swamp is growing. The world may ultimately be inhabited by frogs. Air pollution is not really as great a threat to future generations as frog pollution. 30. The swamp is ultimately evil. Hannah Arendt described how frog farms, despite their benign appearance, tend to develop bullfrogs with an enormous capacity for evil. Adolf Eichmann was not an aberration either. 31. The job of most swamp managers is to maintain and enhance the swamp. For example, Winston Froghill said, I was not made marsh minister to preside over the training of the swamp. The purpose of swamp consultants in the eyes of swamp managers is to help the swamp operate effectively, not to train it. 33. Most OD literature is designed to facilitate swamp management, not area reclamation. Most managers are frog farmers. Most OD specialists and professors of marsh management are frog farmers' helpers. The relationship is symbiotic. 34. Most frog farmers and their helpers are aware of their lots in the swamp. Most have about all the consciousness they can bear. May God have mercy on their souls. 35. God does have mercy on their souls. Otherwise, God would be the greatest frog farmer of all of them all. Alternatives to life on the frog farm. To all those objects around, it is indeed a lonely life on the lily pad. What is the alternative to life in the swamp, you may ask? My pen is poised to frame a reply. After all, isn't that my job as a responsible frog professor to provide some answers to the problems of a dismal swamp? Temptation is great. Suddenly, though, I see that sign on my lily pad and realize that another feature of frogs is that they are frequently afraid to think. It's not that the thoughts are not there. In fact, in the swamp, there are plenty of thoughts to be thought. Who is to think them? Certainly not frogs, because thinking is as dangerous to the ecology of the swamp as passing gas in the fog. Not thinking or getting someone else to be responsible for thinking one's thoughts is not without its advantages. As long as a frog can get someone else to take responsibility for changing the climate of the swamp. I do know, though, that non-cosmetic organizational development involves swamp drainage and area reclamation and is done by humans, not frogs. Ultimately, that process of drainage and reclamation destroys the swamp and includes such modifications in the swamp environment as building habitats that allow people to cooperate rather than compete. Such habits allow people to get paid as pairs, teams, and organizations rather than as individuals. If two individuals get paid for working as a pair, it is amazing how much interest they take in helping one another succeed. Work in non-zero sum climates when it comes to promotion, layoffs, salary, performance appraisal, and grades. For example, during bad times, frogs lay others off in terms of seniority. People don't lay one another off at all. They all take proportional pay cuts and therefore learn they can rely on one another during both good and bad times. People with zero-sum attitudes believe that the outcome of any interpersonal encounter is zero. That is, if you get any payoff of +1, I must get a payoff of -1, and the outcome is zero. Stated in day-to-day language, people with that attitude say, if you win, I must lose. People with non-zero-sum attitudes believe that the outcome of any human encounter can be other than zero. That is, we can both win. And if we do, under certain conditions, it is not 1 + 1 = 2, but rather with synergism, 3. Leave the environment when they lose interest in it. For example, when it comes to vesting of rights, people don't wear vests, frogs do. Accept personal responsibility for their own activities in the habitat. Frogs, for instance, demand that bullfrogs take responsibility for the swamp. People will not permit others to take over their responsibilities for the habitat and its operations. Trust one another in a wide variety of situations. Frogs distrust most everybody. Given their distrust, they put in time clocks which say, we don't trust you to do an honest day's work. So prove that you did. They demand doctor's certificates when someone calls in ill. Officers so that others' access to them is limited, and so that their conversations and work with other frogs can't be observed and overheard. They demand close verification of expense accounts because everyone knows those slick swamp salesmen would rob the marsh blind if a bullfrog doesn't keep tabs on them. They keep just-in-case files to protect themselves from other frogs' poisons. People have, by contrast, very few rules and procedures that question the honesty of others. In fact, they assume other people can be trusted and live with the reality that in a few cases, such trust will be violated. Be treated as subjects, not objects. R.D. Laing has pointed out that one way to make others feel mentally ill is to treat them as depersonalized objects or things. That is, objectively, rather than as personalized subject, that is, subjectively. Bullfrogs try to treat others objectively. They try to gauge the performance of others objectively, and they try to keep their feelings out of the situation. However, when you treat another objectively, that is, as an object, you should know that the price of being objective, eliminating one's feeling from the situation, is that you have become an object yourself, since you have denied the very essence of your own humanness. Thus are bullfrogs born. Humans don't treat one another as objects. They try instead to build a work environment in which human subjectivity is accepted, part of the habitat's problem-solving process. You still haven't answered the question of what do we do to save ourselves from the swamp, you may say? But too vague, too idealistic, too impractical. You certainly have not fulfilled your responsibility as an article writer. I hope you don't feel that way, but if you do, about all I say is, you're right, I haven't tried. I haven't. I tried. Repeat. That's the article that I wanted to read. I know there are many things written in the article that are still relevant today in many organizations. For many people, in many organizations are not treated as people, but as frogs. There were certain passages that were particularly very poignant and relevant for today's context. For example, one of the places where he talks about the fact that how you treat people objectively or subjectively has a significant impact, is something that I see happening all around the world today. Israelis treating Palestinians like um, objects, desensitize people, and consider them as something not people, is one of the ways that you can actually do whatever you want and get away with it. Same thing happens across the world. I'm not just trying to call out Israelis or Palestinians, but every time there is a us versus them, you will find that there is desensitization of them in a way or other. It's true in the social context, it's true in the organizational context, it's true in the familial context. So another area where I thought was really poignant and relevant today is also um, abduction of responsibility and thinking. I know a lot of organizations where um, people are not allowed to think. They're just expected to follow the process. It is the job of the leaders to actually think on behalf of the entire organization. While in some contexts they may work, for example, in the case of a McDonald's, they don't want the store manager to kind of try out different recipes or try out different kind of foods. They only want them to follow the process. But the moment you want to change something, or if the moment you want creativity or innovation or um, uh, you know response to a given changing situation, you want everyone to think on their feet, and not just think on their feet, but also to um, do relevant thinking, which means that they need to not only understand the context in which they are operating, but also what is the objective that the organization is trying to achieve. That can only happen if the leaders constantly and consistently talk about what is it that they want to achieve as an organization, where is it that they want to go, articulate the vision, and also put in the guardrails as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. Once you put those constraints and once you have painted the picture, um, everyone in the organization can then think for themselves and also respond to any situation that arises that requires them to respond to. That increases agility, that increases the ability for people to be creative, to bring their full selves to work. That also creates a culture where you treat people as people and not just as machines or resources. Another area which I thought was very poignant and still relevant today is corporate speak, which the article talks about as the language of ribbit. I've seen this play out so many times. People speak in keywords. People speak in words that they do not necessarily understand. People speak things that, for example, like innovation, like transformation, like digital transformation, um, you know, which have become devoid of meaning because it is not, those are terms that are just being used, not really meant, which takes up so much time, energy, and effort. Another thing that I found very relevant was around the performance appraisal piece. So if he talks about how if two people are compensated based on the work they do together, they will definitely take interest in each other's work. He also talks about how each individual is assessed on what they are doing and are assessed out of context objectively. But in reality, what is needed is to have a global optimum or people performing in such a way that the organization as a whole benefits, not just an individual trying to do what he wants to do or she wants to do really well In some cases, this behavior tends to harm the organization in the long run than benefit them. This is how you find bankers earn millions of dollars in bonuses despite running their banks down the ground, because individual incentives are not tied to the organizational incentives. One way that I have written about, that I speak about at many places, is the importance of having one goal for the entire organization. And if the organization achieves the goal, everyone benefits. If they don't, everyone suffers. We also talk about layoffs. Again, very relevant to today's environment and the context that we are living in. We are looking at organizations like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, even SAP, all of them laying people off or letting people go in the name of cost cutting, in the name of being ready for the future. Even decades before, Harvey talks about how it is easier for everyone to take a pay cut and show that they are all together in this together, rather than just randomly lay people off. Laying people off randomly only tells their employees that there's no loyalty. Today it's your friend, tomorrow it could be you. And when the organization does really well, the bonuses are also not shared equally. A lot of times, organizations get into a position of being overly inflated in terms of employees simply because the leaders did not have or exercise enough caution while hiring these people, or did not get their strategy right, or did not get the products right. So those are decisions that the leaders were responsible for at one point in time or the other, but they don't suffer. It is very rare that the people decide to take responsibility, not just in words, but also in action. Very rare leader who does that. So all in all, I think even though this article was written like decades back, I still think that the situation that is described in the article is as relevant today in a lot of organizations. And some of the things that he suggests as remedies for this are also as relevant today as it was decades back. I'll share a link or the document as well as part of the comments or as part of the description of this video, so that if you want, you can also read the entire document as well. I hope you're not turning yourself into a frog. You're not giving or abdicating responsibility to think and to act to anyone else. I hope and pray that as a leader, you are not turning into a bullfrog or professor, or and you are not doing performance reviews objectively without emotions. We are emotional beings. That's one of our strengths. Let's play to it. Let's bring our full selves to the work. Let's treat people as people and not as objects. Thanks.